the Medical AI Podcast.
Hello, I'm Dr. Felix Beecher, and this is the Medical AI Podcast, a 30-minute thrill ride of big ideas. We talk to a range of top guests, from industry innovators to scientists to philosophers. This is brought to you by Omdia and Informatech, where I'm the head of healthcare technology. Tom Lawry is one of the biggest beasts in the jungle of medical AI. He has been voted as one of the most recognized leaders for change in healthcare. He is a strategic advisor to health leaders worldwide, and he is the best-selling author of the books Hacking Healthcare and AI in Health. Tom and I recently recorded a podcast on the implementation of medical AI, but we got together again to discuss some of the other big current topics. Enjoy. Tom, it is an enormous pleasure to have you back on the podcast. Very, very big welcome.
Hey, I'm honored that you actually have me back, Felix. Thank you.
So, Tom, you've got many hats. One of those hats is as an incubator, and I'm very interested to know more about that. The image I have in my mind, by the way, is of you being this kind of bee buzzing around pollinating all of these flowers in a meadow. Now, so can you talk a bit about your work as a medical AI incubator?
Well, it's a great question. I've got to think about that for just a second. So, as we talked, in the first episode where we had me on, I've had the privilege almost from the time I graduated from the university at always being in and around healthcare, mainly in the U.S. to start with, but then eventually roles that where 80% of my time was working outside the United States with, some really great providers and clinicians. And so when it comes to being called an incubator advisor, whatever you want to call it, I simply have the benefit and the privilege of having worked with so many people on the front lines of health and medicine who are there trying to solve the big problems. As a mentor of mine used to say, none of us is as smart as all of us. As I said earlier, everyone's early in the healthcare journey for artificial intelligence. We're all learning together. I just happen to have the privilege of spending full time and a lot of years starting out basically in healthcare and data analytics. And I've kind of grown up as this has evolved. And it's continuing to evolve, as you know. So a lot of what I've done as an advisor is parachute into big organizations and work with people trying to, solve problems. And along the way, almost always in health and medicine, to me, the answer is rooted in the data available and how we put that data to use. When you think about the entire process of medicine, making a diagnosis, coming up with a treatment, it's all data-driven. So our ability to take that data, make it easier to access, make it smarter, and put it in the hands of those clinicians and healthcare executives who, again, as we talked earlier, have that wisdom, that knowledge, that experience of taking that data and making the best decision for that patient sitting in front of them. That's what it's all about. And no one's got a lock on how that's done. Again, when it comes to data and AI, we're all learning. But the more I've had the opportunity to work with people who are really solving some amazing problems, if I can impart something great, but most of the time I'm learning at least as much as what I've imparted, which then I get to take and go somewhere else for that next experience. So had the privilege of doing that with big provider organizations around the world, equally deep on working with a lot of those companies who are the purveyors of medical devices, software solutions that are going into healthcare. So the more that happens, and the more, as we've talked about before, we can bring together a better approach to all that data to empower people. I mean, that's really what the incubation is all about.
Okay, let's talk about COVID as well. How has, and I'm sure the answer to this is very, very complex, but could you try and distill some wisdom about how COVID has related to the development of medical AI?
Yeah, great question. I actually did an article for Forbes a while back where they asked me to do a piece on what did we learn, or what did healthcare learn from COVID? And, I titled the article, We Interrupt This Pandemic to Bring You Some Good News. So, as the world descended into this darkness initially with this pandemic, all of us were impacted. But eventually, I think the things we mainly learned included an industry known for moving at glacial speed showed it could move at warp speed when it needed to. Two, there were a lot of clinical and health leaders who demonstrated their ability to adapt quickly and actually rise to the occasion and make rapid change to benefit those they were trying to serve. And then I think the pivot point for me anyway, and it's a big part of my last book, Hacking Healthcare, when you look at that change and that agile transformation, it was, people basically fought and won the battle. But the weapons they chose to go faster were all AI related. So you look at things like, prior to COVID, it took an average of 10 to 11 years to bring a drug or a vaccine from concept into approval and use. Through the use of AI and some other things, the COVID vaccination came forward in less than 2 years. You look at things like telehealth has been around, and the literature clinically shows it has provided clinical value for 3 decades, and yet it took a pandemic for that to get pulled forward and have clinicians and consumers try it. And guess what? Many of the consumers loved it. They're not going back. So what we learned is, again, we are capable of moving quickly. Healthcare is capable of change. And I guess my bottom line is, and it's the question and the challenge, if we could do that for COVID, let's take those same learnings and apply them to start solving faster those other big problems like chronic disease, like the opioid crisis, like all those things that I believe we could use the same process and many of the same tools to make further progress.
Now, let's think about clinical trials and vaccine development. In the case of COVID, I guess I want to provoke you a little bit, because I think what I want to say is that AI may give people a somewhat false sense of robustness. As far as I'm concerned, there's no AI technique which can replace a phase 3 clinical trial. So we still need clinical trials to establish safety and efficacy, right? There's no kind of shortcut there. But actually what we have ended up with is vaccines being approved without those kind of long-term trials being necessarily available. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, Felix. So if we look at the question of, what's the value that AI may be bringing to things like clinical trials? Number one, even just use of, some a better use of data and some other AI capabilities to look at how to structure and fill those clinical trials with a representative sample of the population to which is acquired legally and to which you hope will benefit those eventually when that drug gets put into common use. Two, things as simple as, and they're happening now, where, I believe one of the biggest challenges of clinical trials is how do you make sure they're representative of the population served? Many times these things can be, I'll call it uneven. AI gives you the ability to help sift, sort, and go after a better balanced population for trials. Beyond that, there's some great work being done here in the United States. Scripps Research Institute, Dr. Eric Topol are doing some amazing work essentially on virtualizing clinical trials by going through a new process of digital clinical trials. Much of that's driven by AI and better use of data. And then finally, if we take one step back, I would say anyone who's interested, go out and I'm sure you can do a search in any search engine, but look up the story Moderna tells about how quickly they were able to be the first to get a drug out there and approved for COVID. There's a lot of coverage, including up to the CEO, who basically tells the story about how they couldn't have done that without their earlier investment, and they were one of the early leaders at bringing AI into automating their clinical trials and development processes. So it doesn't negate, as we've talked about before, certain things that must happen that are human-oriented. But our ability to look at that process, map it, and then say, here's where the better use of data and AI, we can go faster, or we can automate it in a way that somehow produces a measurable benefit.
Mm-hmm. But still, the idea of going from the concept to an approved treatment in 2 years is... I mean, you have to cut so many corners, you end up with a circle. I mean, potentially, right? I mean, and that's what I mean by kind of. I completely agree that AI methods can grease the wheels of the clinical trial process, but it can't. If you cut too many corners,
you mentioned that, Felix. Let me back up, because I don't want to be seen as the AI cheerleader. We have had a lot of things in the last few years where, I've said it before, AI has been the shiny object. AI has been the promise to do many things it cannot do at the present time.
Yeah.
So it's always good to really stand back and again, understand what is it that AI is good at, that if applied in the proper way, can benefit those humans who are driving a process that humans should always be in charge of. They should always be the ones making judgment, whether it's on an individual patient or on the validity of putting a drug out for tens of thousands of people to use. And, I'm always going to come back to that. AI is a tool. It allows us to outsource certain things. It does not replace the people or the critical aspects of any process, be it clinical trials or being that individual physician who is responsible and accountable for the best diagnosis for that patient sitting in front of them.
Yeah. Now, it's perfectly testable empirically whether an AI system has better clinical judgment than a human doctor, right? And for diagnosis, prognosis, treatment selection, all sorts of things. Now, there's no reason why a machine shouldn't outperform a human. And if that were the case, would you not therefore prefer to replace that doctor with a machine?
I'm laughing. Okay, how do I give a simple answer to that? So look, there's lots of stuff out in the literature on how in certain things like diagnosing skin lesions and cancer that AI and a test against well-trained human clinicians actually performs better. So fine, let's give them the trophy for outperforming certain things. When you put such tools, such capabilities in practice in the wild, in the real world, it's far more complex. So this is where I've talked before about this whole area of correlation versus causation. AI is really good at finding correlations between variables. But correlation can be very different than causation, which is at the heart of humans, doctors, nurses, using all those skills AI will never replace to make the best decision and judgment. So a quick example, again, I use it in one of the courses I teach. Everyone listening, is now engaged as part of a new study we're doing. And what we found is that we found this cause of death that no one's talking about that we want to bring to light. And so what we've done is we've taken massive amounts of data and some great AI tools, and we've discovered, and this is real, there's almost a perfect correlation between per capita cheese consumption in the United States and the number of people who die by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. So here's the thing. If everyone listening would just step away from the cheese platter tonight, we might be able to save lives. So I'll stop being facetious. It makes the point of give me data and I can find correlations, which may have nothing to do with what's really going on in the real world. So it's that balance of humans with data and AI behind them. It's not the other way around. Those who, wring their hands over AI in health and medicine typically are looking at AI being in front of the humans.
Yeah.
In reality, doing this right, AI is a tool like everything else that's ever come into medicine and had impact. It's a tool we bring in behind the humans, the people with all of those things that I'm going to count on when it comes to my own healthcare.
No, I think you put it very, very well, Tom. Although I might give some types of cheese a wide berth from now on, just to be on the safe side. Okay, Tom, let's talk about the new kid on the block, the thing that everyone's talking about, and that is ChatGPT. How would you describe the potential applications of ChatGPT?
Yeah, well, I'm not actually here. This is really GPT as a sub. No, I think it's a perfect example of so many things to think about and be aware of. First of all, GPT, and then a lot of great work being done in what's known as large language models is incredible work. And it's going to have great benefit going forward across all industry, especially health and medicine. Having said that, as I keep saying, GPT is the current darling, the shiny object of AI. And it's getting a lot of uptake, a lot of coverage. And again, we're super early in the journey of what it is and how to apply it. But right now, it's doing an amazing job of revolutionizing search, conversation, text completion. The thing people aren't talking about much today that I would at least put a stake in the ground is eventually GPT is going to do some really interesting work in looking at natural language processing applied to things like imaging. So anyone who has spare time, go out to OpenAI, go into what's known as DALL-E 2, where basically it's a tool where type in any phrase or word, and it will use your natural language to come up with an image. And whether that's art, whether that's cartoons, or eventually whether it's how that gets applied to things like medical images. But again, the promise is large. We're going to continue looking at what it is, how to apply, and there'll be many applications. And at the same time, we want to be mindful of we're very early. There's another company that I won't mention because I don't want to sound like I'm trash talking, but they put out something similar to their large language model last year. They touted it highly as something that could be used for development of research papers and other things. And it was a very elegant tool, but it was overhyped. It wasn't ready for prime time. And so within a matter of weeks, you started seeing things appear like medical research papers on the benefits of chewing broken glass, the history of gorillas in space, all of which were done by, a large language model. So it has its value, but it also has, a lot of downsides. And that's where taking a cautiously optimistic approach and really teasing out what it is, how it will be used, as we talked about in the earlier episode, what are the guardrails that need to get put around it? Those are the things that are coming. But for now, it's a great shiny object. It's doing amazing things. And it's demonstrating the evolution of AI. And I can guarantee if you have me back 24 months from now, there'll be something equally compelling that we haven't cooked up yet.
Okay. Good. All right. There's one last thing that I really am very, very keen to ask you about. When I was still working in neuroscience in academia, neuroimaging was still completely within the purview of academics. And that started to change. And in general, there has been much more encroachment of big tech companies into AI, including medical AI. Now, could you talk to that a little bit? I know that you do work with Microsoft, so you're in a really great position to talk about that.
Yeah, well, let me maybe genericize that question. Everyone's streaming into AI, as they do. Big companies like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, companies all the way down the food chain to startups. Many of them are totally focused on AI. And then the next level in their journey is, well, which segments do we pay attention to? And health and medicine is a huge segment. So there are times where companies that may be really great at technology that have no background in health and medicine are going to focus there. And we're seeing that, if you look back in history, even at the dot-com era, same thing happened. And I think there are many models. So some of the big companies, some have a model of we're actually going to get into the health and medicine business. So, coming to you soon are big tech companies who in some ways are actually competing with those provider organizations. Other models in the big tech world are ones where they want to be in the business of AI and data, but they actually want to own, control, and use that medical data that often starts with the individual patient. And then there are other models where big tech companies are basically creating tools, but they're staying out of being direct competitors with provider orgs. They're staying out of the world of owning and controlling medical data, and instead they're giving provider organizations and others the tools to be better at all those things that are the natural things those provider organizations do now and perhaps have done for 100 years. So if you just look at those three examples of models, the first thing I would say whenever you're looking at a tech company is to say, are they trying to go and do a first-party play by now being a provider as a tech company? Are they trying to use tools but then own and control and manipulate consumer health data, or are they simply providing tools that enable those organizations in healthcare to be better? So those are the three models. Why is everyone trying to get into it? Well, there's a lot of data, and frankly, there's a lot of money that rolls through healthcare. And the ability to package all of that, I think, is going to be important going forward to say, what's the right balance? And I'd bring it back to, what's the right balance to be better at improving quality, improving access for all, and creating systems that are far more efficient in the future than they are today?
So what do you think is best for the field in terms of the development and the progress of medical AI? Is that because I can see it both ways? On the one hand, these massive corporations like Google, Amazon, and Microsoft have just unlimited funds to invest, but on the other hand, they could end up monopolizing the field and stifling competition. So, what's your take on that?
Well, that's a tricky bit. I would say I'll give a personal answer. Having spent almost a decade actually walking the halls of hospitals and health systems and trying to run a healthcare organization, and anyone in healthcare knows this, there's no other segment in the business world that works the same way healthcare does, whether it's the business you're in, if you can call healthcare a business, whether it's the economics of how you generate revenue and your expenses. It's totally unique. The knowledge of those people who have been trained and grew up in healthcare is unique. So when you see any company, large or small, deciding that their business plan says, let's focus on healthcare, If you look at the history of organizations, particularly tech organizations doing this, most of the time with Flourish, they announce something, they invest in it, and many times they end up on the rocks instead of in port. And I'm not saying that that happens with everyone, but I'm saying, I believe that technology's role is to get behind those who know, who are experienced in healthcare and medicine to support their efforts to be better. And again, technology plays a huge role, whether it's AI, whether it's all the things we saw when COVID hit on allowing us to be collaborative and work from anywhere. But the best ideas in my 20-some years of being in data and technology in healthcare, the best ideas for how to use the technology that is being created never comes from the big companies. They come from the people on the front lines who, when they're driving home at night, when they're on the subway, and they're thinking, if only there was a way to fix this. Those are the people that have the best ideas. Pay attention to those people. Look at how you help them understand the technology capabilities to come in behind them to change a process. That's where we drive value.
Now, I guess with medical AI, a big part of the solution is the data that is typically collected by big pharma companies and medical device companies. But my impression is there seems to be something of a tension within those companies, because on the one hand, they have released an awful lot of clinical trial data, for example, but on the other hand, there's a lot of clinical trial data which they have not released. And so obviously the data is the food of medical AI, right? And without that food, nobody can develop anything. So, this is the kind of dynamic I'm trying to figure out. And also whether there is a sort of, do you think there's an increasing tendency for big pharma companies to work with big tech companies? And what do you think the implications of that might be?
Well, Felix, there were like 6 questions in that one. But
I know, and I apologize.
Well, let me see if I can parse that. So number one, it's interesting to me, as I travel around, particularly in big healthcare organizations as an advisor, there are times where I'm working with an executive team and someone's come back from a conference or they've read an article and all of a sudden they're espousing that, hey, data is the new currency in health and medicine. And I always love when I hear that, because I love posing the next question. If data is the new currency in healthcare, are you managing your data the same way you manage your financial assets? And usually there's a pause and a stare, and then we get to have the good conversation where data is a valuable asset. The better you are at enabling, creating that modern data estate to do things at scale with any analytics, including AI, that's the value proposition of getting it right. Second, we're not talking about machine-generated data that's coming off of a computer sensor in your Mercedes going into a database to do predictions and other things. We're talking about highly personal data for you, the person next to you, and everyone else. So, the level of seriousness and degree of difficulty of making sure that data is secure, safe, used in only appropriate ways is a huge, huge mountain to climb. And that's where medical organizations have many decades of experience. They are the most trusted. So when you start looking at the co-exchange of this sensitive information between provider organizations, pharma companies, and big tech, the simple question to any consumer or physician is, who do you trust with that data? And then finally, the whole matter of trust. There are many things that can be done with smart systems and AI, but the corollary is people will only use things they trust. So, that's probably a roundabout answer, but it's a huge issue. Finding ways to be able to liberate that data, democratize it to do good, while always keeping the promise to the consumer of, we're always going to use that data appropriately, it will always be secure, It will never be used for purposes that would make you nervous.
Now, I suppose that in the case of big tech and big pharma, trust these days is not great. Do you think that's fair? Do you think this is a problem?
Well, I think tech companies are highly trustworthy when it comes to their core business and what they do. There have been various surveys with consumers of who would you trust with your medical data, and it's not that tech companies are low on the list, but they're certainly not the highest on the list when it comes to where consumers want their data stored and used. But again, it's finding that balance of being able to use the great solutions and tools coming out of these tech companies, aligning those with the processes for the delivery of health and medical services. It always calls into question, the simple but hard question answer of, well, who owns that data? And how you answer that question, then the next question is, and how is that used in an appropriate way that still facilitates trust for the person whose data you're using?
Okay, so look, Mark, one last question. And this is, I began the interview by saying you have lots of hats. And I'm now going to ask you to put your futurology hat on. And this is a question which is more about trying to get you to think like a science fiction author than an AI developer or something. So if you just, if you cast your mind 50 years into the future, what kind of future, what kind of impressions of that future can you give us?
Well, I'm going to dodge that question slightly. One, I'm going to look 20 years out, number one. Number two, instead of giving my opinion, I'm going to give an opinion of someone else who's far more brilliant and I also agree with. So Kai-Fu Lee is one of my favorite authors and leaders, former president of Google China, senior exec at Microsoft, Apple. His first book, which I would highly recommend, was called AI Superpowers. But his latest book is something called AI 21. And he basically, the whole book is about what the world will look like, not just healthcare, what the world will look like 20 years from now based on how AI is going to transform everything about human existence. It's a great book, about 500 pages long, but there's one sentence in there that caught my eye, and that reads, when we look back in the year 2041, we will likely see healthcare as the industry most transformed by AI. I believe he's correct. And then I would add to that simply, anyone in healthcare today, you're a consumer. 20 years seems like a long time, but that's going to happen a day, a week, a month at a time. And so when you look at the steady progress we're making, again, back to what we were talking about earlier, just look at how GPT has screamed onto everyone's horizon just in the last few months. That's the sort of thing every day, every week, every month is going to be happening until we reach that point Kai-Fu Lee talks about in 2041. So it may be science fiction, but I guess the real thing is we're all going to experience that in increments. And the question is, how will each of us take that, look at it, how to bring it in to do what we think is important while putting all the guardrails on we've talked about in this episode and the last one to make sure that AI is doing good and it's doing good for everyone, not just certain parts of the population. If we can achieve that, I think 20 years from now is going to be a great place to be.
Okay, look, Tom, it has been a huge pleasure and an honor having this conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, it's always my pleasure. You've got a great podcast, and I really appreciate having the opportunity to be on and talk with you about this.
Thanks, Tom. Tom, that was fantastic. I knew it would be. That was like a perfect.
Thank you. Well,
that was like a perfect pair of podcasts.
I think you're an easy guy to draft off of. So
Thank you for listening. I'm Felix Beecher. Ping me on LinkedIn for more information on Omdia's services in healthcare technology. See you next time.